In this episode, Mark Hutchinson talks about his journey of translation and about the novel A Leopard-Skin Hat written by Anne Serre. Mark Hutchinson was born in London and lives in Paris. Among his many translations from the French are René Char's Hypnos, Notes from the French Resistance and the Inventors and Other Poems, and Emmanuel Hocquard's The Library at Trieste and Gardens of the Sallust. His work has appeared in Harper's magazine, the Paris Review, the Times Literary Supplement, and elsewhere. His translation of René Char's The Inventors was one of the Independent's best poetry books of 2015, and his translation of Anne Serre's The Governesses was shortlisted for the 2020 Scott Moncrieff Prize. His translation of A Leopard-Skin Hat by Anne Serre was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize 2025.
Well, my father was a journalist. So in the UK, he grew up in the 30s, when there was a lot of unemployment and stuff. So his father, my paternal grandfather, worked in the mills designing looms, and so he was an engineer. And then you had, the terrible unemployment of the 30s and stuff. So at one point, the family went off. I don't know if the whole family, it was just my father and his father, or the whole family. They went off on a packet boat to Canada to get work. And when they arrived there, it turned out there wasn't any work. So they had to come all the way back. And so what happened? So my father actually started work very young as a cub reporter for the Yorkshire Post, which is a very distinguished newspaper in the north of England, provincial newspaper. So he was a very young. He was 15, I think, when he started there. Well, because you had to get out and work because there was the Depression, So this would have been in about 1935 or something. And then later on, he worked with a very interesting man called Tom Harrison. It was a kind of sociological experiment that he set up. It was quite radical mass observation. That's what it was called. Yeah, it was a sort of left-wing sociological thing where they had volunteers, untrained volunteers all over Britain, who would go and talk to people and interview people about their, how they were responding to various events, particularly during the war. So my father joined Tom. It's forgotten about for a long time, mass observation, but there's now quite a lot of research going on into it because they amassed all this data, because in the run up to the war, everyone was involved in some form or another in sort of propaganda, including the British government, obviously, in the climate at that time. So they would go around interviewing people in the army, talking to people in pubs, trying to find out what people really thought about what was going on. When Coventry got bombed, my father jumped into a car with Tom Harrison and a third person, I forget who it was, and drove up to Coventry after it got badly bombed by the Germans. To find out what people really felt about this or that, or really felt about the government, or really felt about the conduct of the war. So it's like a kind of vast, it's like a kind of anthropological, like a semi-anthropological study, but instead of going off to find out about the society or lives of someone on the other side of the planet, you were doing it at home with your own people. And then he went off in the war on the Arctic convoys. That's where he, in 42, whenever it was. So that was where he was for the rest of the war. Out in the freezing Arctic, trying to avoid being blown up by U-boats and stuff. And then after the war, he was a journalist. He worked for Lord Beaverbrook, who's the big, Churchill's friend, the big press baron of those days. He worked with him for a few years and travelled around. So I didn't see much of him when I was a kid, because he used to be away he was always travelling around with Lord Beaverbrook to Russia, to India, to Pakistan. I don't know what he was at. He was sort of his sort of press secretary, and I don't know much about that part of his life, because he was out a lot. Then and I was at school, and then later I went to a boarding school in central London called Westminster. It's a very sort of posh school, and it's kind of ridiculous being at a boarding school when the family lived, 7 stops down the district line or whatever it was, or the circle line, I forget. It's kind of strange. So I was actually what's called a weekly boarder, where you go home on the weekends and stuff. Anyway, so we don't need to go into all that. So my father, by that time, was a well-known journalist. He worked for the Times, the Telegraph, the Spectator. He had a weekly column, where he'd write about whatever he wanted to write about. So yes, there are a lot of books in the house. We had a good few walls of books, and I remember when I was a tiny kid. I don't know what age. It must have been sort of pre-literate age. It must have been about 2 or 3 or something. Sitting on the floor of my parents' bedroom, and they had this low set of glass-fronted bookcases. So if you're a little baby sort of sitting on the floor, you could see all the titles of the books behind the glass. And I remember, being very puzzled by a book by Aldous Huxley called Eyeless in Gaza.
Aldous Huxley.
No, but all I remember about, I don't think I couldn't read the name. I think it must have been before I learned to read even. But I think it must have been when I was learning the alphabet, because it was the fact that it was AZ
Yes.
next to each other, and there was the letter Y in eyeless. So just staring. So I think with the age when you're just staring at the letters, and you're probably just learning the alphabet, whatever age that is. So books were sort of strange, mysterious things behind glass, where letters were arranged in surprising ways, A and Z, which are at the opposite end of the alphabet. Lo and behold, they were flush up against each other, So it's that. Then I went to school, at school, had a wonderful literature teacher who I adored, called Jim Cogan. And he used to make us do things like, this is, when you're 15, 16 or whatever, and he would make you do things like, you'd read Alexander Pope, say, The Rape of the Lock, and he would make you write for homework, he would say, write me a 50 line pastiche in rhyming, in impeccable rhyming couplets. So you did this. It was great fun. So I enjoyed doing that, and so I ended up writing poetry, and then and I did that up until the age of 30, and then for very complicated reasons, I decided, after getting a lot of bad karma from it, I decided to stop writing poetry, but happily, not in some kind of agonized, painful way or anything. Because and poetry is really my great love, because I don't write it anymore, but I still translate it, I still read it all the time. I had a little magazine in London, I had a little magazine when I was at university, which I then handed over to someone else when I left university. I was at UEA in Norwich, the University of East Anglia. They have a whole sort of creative writing thing there. Ian McEwan was there when he was young. He was the sort of first star of UEA, and Ishiguro was there later.
When did you move to France?
I moved to France, 81. So that was I was 23. My father had died a couple of years earlier, so I stayed on a year in London to sort of to help my mother through her mourning and her grief, and then I had always wanted to move to France. I came here when I was a teenager with a lot of snotty school children, and thought, oh, I like this city. This is like you like a pair of shoes. You think, oh, they're just the right, very comfortable, just my kind of city. London's a wonderful city, but it's too big. It's too big for me. Whereas Paris is a city you can walk from one side to the other of Paris in a day. It's one of the first things I did when I arrived in Paris. I took a train.
Even today, it's like that?
Oh yeah, because the 20 arrondissements, which are arranged in a spiral like a snail shell, So I jumped on the metro and went out to the eastern edge of Paris, and then out by the Bois de Vincennes, and then walked in more or less a straight line east to west until I ended up at the racecourse at Auteuil. And there you can see the countryside beyond. But if you try to do this in London, you'd have to walk for 4 days, and you'd still be in Gotham City. I mean, London is a big, huge metropolis, whereas the 20 arrondissements of Paris, they're ridiculously small. It's the center of Paris is not the larger conurbation, not the greater Paris, obviously, with all the suburbs and so on, but the basic 20 arrondissements. You can walk. Picasso and his friends used to walk back from Montparnasse to Montmartre. They go out for the evening and then just walk back. It's probably an hour and a half's walk or 2 hours, but
yeah. So when did the translation happen?
Well, translation began. Well, the first time I did translations was, when I was about 20. I started translating poems mostly, by Rimbaud, Verlaine, Laforgue, André Dubouchet, Cocteau, an extraordinary mix of people. Because at that age you're reading, you're reading Evelyn Waugh, and at the same time you're reading Beckett, and you're also reading Thomas Pynchon. So you have a very sort of promiscuous sort of, you're reading 25 different styles of writers, and in the excitement of youthful discovery of all these exciting writers out there. As I'm sure you know, in the 60s and 70s, Penguin used to have a fantastic series of translated poetry where they would just put often with just prose mot à mot, just word for word prose translations at the foot of the page, and the original. They had several different types of book. They would either have sort of they had a kind of two types. They either had the Oxford book of, or the Penguin book of, the Penguin book of, say, French verse, and then they would just have the French text and then a little prose translation at the foot of the page in a smaller font, in a smaller typeface. And so it's just a sort of way of, you think, okay, what's going on here? This is a poem, it's down prose at the foot of the page. So you just sort of start, trying your hand at that to, partly to understand what's going on, which is sort of one of my main motivations for translation. If I translate something, it's usually because I love it and I want to sort of know more about it. in the same way that you meet a wonderful woman and or whoever, and you want to know more about her. So you start translating and see how this works in English, and also because have a I'm now pretty sort of fluent in French. Most people would say I'm fluent in French, but I find the whole notion of fluency of a language is a kind of odd idea in a way. I mean, who is really fluent even in their own language? Am I as fluent as Shakespeare is? No, we both spoke fluent English, but Shakespeare's English is obviously a very whole different bag of stuff from mine. So the notion of fluency is quite strange to begin with. So let's say I'm sort of fluent in French, but even today, French is sort of not quite so real to me as English is, because it's the language you grew up with. So it's the language you've been living with all your life. From the pre-language state, from the first few years when you didn't speak at all, when you had no language, until the present day. So, certain types of writing I will often read, even though I can perfectly well read them in French because I'm fluent in French, but sometimes I prefer reading them in translation.
Okay.
Discursive books, things that, if I want to read a book by Levi-Strauss, like La Pensée Sauvage or something, I read that in English, because it's beautifully translated. I mean, obviously the book has to be a first-class translation, but usually they are. Yeah, so the beginnings was poetry, and then after I moved to France, I had to sort of make a living, and as I've never wanted to, my own feeling was that once you left school, I didn't ever want to be told what I had to do or how I spend my time and ever again. But of course, so adult life is a bit of a problem because a lot of adult life consists of going back into another institution where however much you spin it, whatever kind of face you try and put on it, you've got a kind of facsimile of the kind of relationship you've just got shot of at school, where you have your, the boss and the people and all these things, and you have to walk on eggs and, walk on eggshells rather. So, I'm very attached to my freedom, so you have to pay a price for that. So I just wanted to, so what can I do where I don't have to go into an office every day and, bow to my superiors and be pushed around and told what to do and what to think. So translation, okay, I can translate, but I can be a freelance translator. And you think, okay, that'll be fine. And once they realize how good I am at this, they'll start paying me, serious sums of money. It doesn't happen like that at all.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that, fortunately, when I started out, because had I known it, I probably looked for another solution to this problem. Because it's very, very badly paid translation, but that's just the way it is. There's nothing you can do about it. So translation, that if you're living abroad, I mean, you know who Ralph Mannheim is, I'm sure. The famous, super famous translator. I mean, he's probably the most famous translator of the 20th century. He's a bit of a kind of patron saint to translators. He actually only really started getting involved in literature in his 40s. Before that, he was doing a lot of I don't know exactly where he's working, probably doing stuff for the United Nations and all kinds of stuff and art books and stuff. And he only started doing fiction, I forget when it was, and when he was about 40 or 45, I think. So that's how you make, so when you're doing it freelance and it's your only source of income and you've got to do it all year round, and at the same time, I'm in France, not in England. What you end up doing most of the time is art books. art books and exhibition catalogues, because a lot of big museums, if they're doing a big traveling exhibition and it's starting, if it's curated by a French curator and it's originated in France, then they'll do the catalogue, and they'll do the English language catalogue as well, because it's more more profitable for them to do the thing themselves and then farm it out, in partnership with an American or a British museum, an English museum, or an American museum, or wherever it's traveling to afterwards. So there's always there's always quite a lot of work around like that, and same for art books generally, monographs and stuff. So I did a lot of that. Well, I did practically exclusively for 30 years, 40 years. I only really started translating. Like I say, with poetry, I was, poetry I translated for love. So I translated when it's a selection of 2 books for René Char over the years, which were published by your compatriots and Seagull Books, which was great because they were because I wanted to do them separately, and quite a lot of those 2 books I did much earlier. But everybody says, "Oh no, it's not a big enough book," so they wanted to put them together. But there weren't enough poems, I thought, to make a selection. I'd have needed with the Char's famous resistance book, like Hypnos, the Feuilles d'Hypnos in French. Feuilles d'Hypnos in French. There are a couple of English publishers who wanted to do it, but they wanted to do it as one book, and I said no. So I sort of waited for a long time, and then Naveen set up this amazing outfit, Seagull Books, and which just changed the face of everything, because people weren't doing literary translation anyway. The French have always been, to their credit, have always been really, they publish mountains of literary translations, but in the English and American worlds, it goes in waves. There are periods when it comes back into fashion, and then publishers lose interest in it. There was a big period in the 60s. Because you had amazing magazines like Modern Poetry in Translation, that was founded by Ted Hughes and Daniel Weissport, and you had all these Penguin series, and you had people like John Calder. So there was a lot of translation going on, and then it sort of dropped away. So and it didn't really, and it's Seagull Books are really a large part responsible for the renewed interest in. I mean, with a couple of like New Directions have also been translating a lot under Barbara Epler's directorship and so on. But there was a period when in the English and American speaking world there wasn't much going on translation wise. That's now changed, and so I did those, and then my old friend Anne comes into the picture, because Barbara at New Directions became interested in her work, and I thought, okay, so if we're going to translate Anne into English, I'm definitely going to do this, because it's very important that it be done well, and it's also important, I think, for that a writer their work doesn't get scattered across too many translators, because because then you get sort of that creates a problem. I think it's ideally you want the same translator doing because you want a kind of coherent continuity, coherence, consistency, and continuity. Plus the fact that she's my dear old friend, and we've been talking about books every day for 40 years. So
So, what's so special about Anne? Anne means in her writing. See, you moved from poetry to prose to translator, right? Kind of.
Yes, but don't forget, I've been translating prose, as a jobbing translator, as it were. All this stuff, all these art books, and that's all prose. It's discursive prose, though. Of course, it's not fictional prose, so that's a big difference. As I just said, the main things. Okay, if Anne is going to appear in English, I'm going to do this.
Okay.
Because I want to be certain it's done well, really well, and I've got all the added advantages that we talk all the time, and if there's anything we disagree, if there's anything I don't, it's not unclear, or I just pick up the phone and talk to her, and so I thought, okay, I'm going to do this, and also, I was a bit tired of doing all the sort of discursive prose I've been translating for years, and so it was good, and I'd just done the Char books had just come out, and I thought, okay, let's do Anne now. But it's it's complicated because I don't I'm not a critic or a literary scholar. I'm first and foremost a very close friend of Anne's, and I quite like the idea as well of reading as a form of friendship. I think reading is in some ways a kind of extension of friendship, even with people you don't know. I mean, you form a bond with a writer. And if a writer can't, if you don't feel a bond forming with a writer, you're not going to you're not going to pursue your relationship with that writer. She was born in Bordeaux in 1960, the second of three sisters, grew up in Orléans, a provincial town called Orléans, where her father was deputy headmaster at the Lycée Potier, and he also taught classics, Latin and Greek. And there's a really wonderful talk she gave about this. If you can get if you can get access to the Time Literary Supplement behind their paywall or wherever it is, there's a wonderful talk we published there called "Alone with the Night Watchman," about her time there and her sisters and so on. And then she came up when she was 17. She came up to Paris to study literature at the Sorbonne, and she did her master's thesis on 17th century fairy tales. So that's the biographical. I mean, for other things on the net, there are a lot of quite a few interviews with her, either in English or in French. You can easily find it on the net. And like I say, she also has a website. Another thing a couple of other things I wanted to say a word about. For anyone interested in knowing a bit more about Anne, there are a couple of two or three sort of very interesting essays about her. One by an American writer called Sophia Samatar, Samatar, who has her own website, and you can find the article, the little essay there, called Island Writing, and it's a really remarkable little. It's just like one of those amazing encounters where someone on the other side of the planet has discovered your work and is almost your sort of perfect reader, who understands, who's grasped all the little unstated silent things and subtleties, and it's a short essay, but it's absolutely remarkable. And there's also a very good piece by a young English novelist who writes for the London Review of Books called Lucy Elvin, and that's a remarkable piece as well, because it's it's one of those long essay reviews that the London Review of Books specializes in. And Lucy writes not only about the books in English, but she's also read most of Anne's books in French as well, the untranslated ones. So, because she's got some French background in her family. So that's very interesting as well. If anyone wants to know a little bit more stuff, you can find online. And the last thing I wanted to mention is specifically about A Leopard-Skin Hat. There was a little thing, I don't know if you saw it, there's an online media outlet non-profit media outlet where academics write from time to time, called The Conversation. And there's a remarkable, it's just a short review of the leopard-skin hat by a professor of literature called Lee Wilson, and which makes some very interesting remarks, very astute remarks about the leopard-skin hat, and particularly about the last chapter. But I'll let you discover that. I won't say any more about that. So what else can I tell you about Anne? Perhaps just mention briefly, because she's mentioned this in interviews as well, she had some notable early encounters. One was the novelist Julien Gracq, after she moved to Paris. I forget how she bumped into Julien Gracq. She certainly wasn't the kind of person who would sort of go out of her way to meet someone famous, who's a famous French novelist. And I forget how she met him exactly, because this is before I knew Anne that she met him. And she ended up, she would go around to Julien Gracq's home once a month, and they would sit in their respective armchairs and talk about literature and writing, and he obviously took a slightly sort of paternal interest, and he would ask her if she was eating enough and stuff like this, and she did this, and this went on for a couple of years, I think. And Anne actually rather amusingly describes, she says, I think it was my first successful psychoanalysis, because it was a conversation where they're all sitting in two chairs, like a psychoanalyst and his or her patient. So that was an important, because she would have been like 20 at the time, and Julien Gracq was a famous novelist who she'd read and admired. So that was encouraging for her. And she also, around the same time, ran into a famous actor called Alain Cuny, who you may not know about. He's a sort of actor's actor. He's not, he's not in the. He's in all. You've probably seen him. He's in Fellini films, and he was a big theatre actor, a very powerful, tall, imposing man with a booming voice. He was a friend of Artaud when he was younger, and so she met him. So he was quite made, and she also met a very eccentric Italian sort of minimalist composer called Giacinto Chelsea, which, if you know about sort of modern minimalist music, a very interesting man who she met in Rome and became pals with her. And so these people I met with her as well. So what can I tell you about her? She's a very big reader of fiction. I always say she's the best. I've never met. She's the best read person I know when it comes to fiction in Paris, in France. I mean, I'm sure there are other extremely. Well, I've never met them. You can talk to her. You can talk to her about Jane Austen or Homer or Peter Handke or Robert Walser or anybody. I mean, she's read everything. I mean, she just devours fiction. She thinks in terms of fiction, and she's got she's got a kind of English side to her, Anne. She sometimes thinks she sort of may have been English in another life, in that she believes deeply in the powers of the imagination. She's not at all interested in literary theory and stuff like that. When I say not at all interested, I mean I have to nuance that slightly. She's not, she's read and likes read and likes Roland Barthes, for example. But I mention that, but why I mention that is because in reviews of her in English, the word metafictional often comes up, and it's quite funny because I get the impression people think that, sort of imagine that she's a sort of great admirer of Alain Robbe-Grillet, say, or the Nouveau Roman, and she isn't. I mean, she loves Nathalie Sarraute, but she's not at all interested in theory, in literary theory, or just in passing. But she's a great believer in in the tools of the imagination, the literary imagination, in a way that is closer in spirit to the way the British think about literature. From Coleridge onwards, the great sort of theoretician of the imagination, who made this. So she's got a very kind of English faith in the apparatus of fiction is is fully the equal of any abstract sort of philosophical reflections. Everything you need to understand the world, and possibly better than the philosophers can understand it. Is there anything in the was there anything in Freud that wasn't in Shakespeare, as Freud would have been the first to admit? Is there anything in philosophy that hasn't been better said by, I don't know, Cervantes or whatever? So she's a great believer in the specific tools of the literary imagination. So that's really important. And I don't want to over egg this, but I also often say about Anne that she is very much sui generis. It's because a lot of the things you associate with fiction, like intricate plots, large casts of characters, dialogue, she hardly ever uses. I mean, or uses very sparingly, and sometimes barely at all. And because her books have to be sort of pigeonholed for practical purposes, so they're called novels or short stories. But everything she writes is at a slightly odd angle to those classifications, and nothing she writes is longer than 150 pages. Nothing is longer than what we call a novella in English. But you see, the French don't care about it. The French routinely publish, books of 30 or 40 or 50 pages, and it's make this attitude to book printing is sort of making its way in the English-speaking world. The French have done it always. They've always been like this. They've, if a text is 30 pages, they bring it out as a book. Why on earth not? Okay, it's a wonderful little thing. Let's publish it as a book. Whereas the English will say, no, give me 3 other things. It's not big enough. It's too difficult to sell, so on and so forth. So it's just a different publishing culture. But that seems to be changing as we, because of all these little indie publishers, as we saw, from this year's Booker Prize, International Booker Prize, where most of these books, all but one of them, were less than 150 pages.
Yes, most of them, yes.
Yeah, because indie publishers, of course, probably don't have the same, resources to take on, to compete for big books. So they're doing a lot of smaller books, and people are buying them, which is great. So I think that I think that's an interesting development.
I read the book, A Leopard-Skin Hat. In fact, today, early in the morning, I could finish it. It was a short book, 120 pages short. And I went ahead and read some of her interviews too. And,
Okay.
She says she has written the novel for her sister.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I thought, autobiographical. But when I was reading, the novel, there is a reference to Unica Zone, right?
Okay.
And then I googled about Unica Zone.
Have you read Unica Zone?
No, I have not read. I googled about her.
Okay. Yeah, she's a very, very strange. I'd be very surprised if you'd read her, because not many people know who Unica Zone is. But she was, the partner of Hans Bellmer.
Yeah. Like Fanny, the one of the main character in the book, the girl, Unikazun also had psychological issues, and she had a friend who is an artist, a doll maker by name Belmer.
Yeah, it's Hans Bellmer. Yeah, he was a famous surrealist who did these really creepy things with broken dolls and stuff. It's horrible. I'm not. It's very very unsettling stuff.
Very unsettling.
Well, horror. Yeah.
Yeah, they had a long friendship. These two had a long friendship.
Hmm.
Then I thought this reference is something to indicate their friendship, and in parallel with Fanny and the narrator.
Yes, but they were lovers, weren't they?
Yeah. They were lovers.
Yeah,
Yes.
they were lovers. I mean, it's a little bit different, In the narrator in this book she's his childhood friend. So um, yes, I mean, yes, there's a sort of I think yes, there's an echo of that possibly. I I don't think it's one you could pursue too far, in my opinion. But maybe I'm wrong. I might be wrong. Maybe I think it was just so. Yes, I don't think Unicorn Hans Belmer has any kind of particular parallel. I think one of the things that's going on, I mean, there's a thing that's worth saying about the book. Is the narrator. How can I put this? It's operating on the relationship between the narrator and Fanny operates on several different levels. The narrator, for a start, the narrator that's there. He doesn't have a name. He's just called the narrator. He's a character in the book. He's not the narrator of the book.
Writer also talks about the narrator. That's very interesting.
Yes, that's later on. He talks about it. Yeah. He looks over the shoulder at one point of the narrator, keeping an eye, making sure the narrator's not working too much and getting too worn out. Yeah, no, the narrator is a character in the book, in the same way that you might say a house painter or a heart surgeon. It's just his profession. So the narrator is a storyteller
Coming to
by
the
definition.
translation, right? Anton Her, one of the judges for this year's International Booker, said, talking about this particular book, he said, I think this book in particular really takes on something extra in translation.
Oh, that was Anton Hur, wasn't it? He said that. Yeah.
What exactly is the extra in translation?
Yes, I saw that exchange. I think what he probably meant. I think he was probably talking about what, if you want to get philosophical, it'd be called hermeneutics and the meaning of meaning. He's talking about. I don't know. You remember in Steiner's book, the first chapter is called Understanding as Translation, and it's predicated on the fact that you and I, as we sit and talk here now, are engaged in an act of translation. And that anyone, when you get up and have breakfast with your partner in the morning, that is an act of translation. When you get into bed and make love to someone, that is an act of translation. Everything is an act of translation. We're crossing the divide all the time. So I imagine that what Anton was talking about is that he meant that the complexity of carrying one language over into another somehow mirrors the narrator's desperate struggle to understand his friend. That's what I think he meant. Because, everything is an act of translation. International diplomacy is an act of translation. Love is an act of translation. And at the end of the day, it's all founded on trust. You know?
The entire book is about the narrator trying to understand Fanny.
Yes, and doubting not only his own capacity to understand, because he wants to understand Fanny because he wants to save her because she's falling, but he's constantly plagued by doubts about whether he's capable of doing this, and because he knows, and you learn at the beginning of the book, you find out very early on in the book um, that she was dead at 43. So we know that at the beginning of the book. Yeah, in the beginning, when he describes her, standing in the lake, it's an astonishing image. Yeah.
Wonderful. Now that brings me to my final question. As a reader, how do you evaluate a translation?
Yes, you asked about. Yes, I saw that. Um, well, I think the answer for that is actually quite straightforward. I think you evaluate a translation the same way same way you do any other book. Either a book engrosses you and you want to read on, or it doesn't. Yeah, so there's this thing about the bond. A book must create a bond with a reader. That's what you want from a book. And if you don't get it from a book, you'll just put it aside, and that's the end of that. So, if you ask me specifically about translation, um, the question at that point is, it's not the translation as such, it's whether the translation is successful, whether it's a good translation or not. Because what happens with a poor translation is you start reading it and then you keep stubbing your toes on this or that sentence, and you have to read it again because there's something awkward or clumsy or whatever. And if you do that, you can forgive someone doing that once in a book, but basically that shouldn't happen at all. And when you read a really, there are people there, like we were talking just now about, I was talking just now about War and Peace. I read that in the Aylmer and Louise Maud translation. And they were the people who did the entire 21 volumes of the complete collected works of Lev Tolstoy, that Tolstoy read through. And they were, and there are, lots of competing translation for this, including the Constant Garnet translation from back in the day that everybody argues about in relation to the new Peever translations and stuff, Peever and his wife. But I love the Aylmer and Louise Maud. I think it's just absolutely unbelievable. You read the entire book. It's like 1,800 thin paper pages in the edition that my father took on the Arctic convoys with him. That's the copy I have, and there isn't a duff sentence in it anywhere, not once. And I'd say the same of a few years back. I read Samuel Putnam's translation of Don Quixote, which I think he spent about 10 or 12 years doing, and that's my kind of translator. You do these things properly. If it takes 20 years, if it takes 10 years to do it properly, I'll take 10 years to do it properly. I'm not going to do it in 3 because I've got some publisher breathing down my neck. So I think he spent about 10, 12 years on that, and it's absolutely masterly. Again, it's 1,600 pages in all the 2 books of Don Quixote, and there isn't a single duff sentence. That's what you want from a translation. So you want it to read fluently all the way through, but you don't want it to flatten or misrepresent the author's style or to sacrifice accuracy. You want everything. You're very greedy as a reader. You want it to do everything. And you can play with the English and extend the English, hopefully. And, I do that from time to time, very discreet and in little places. I'll tweak something in a way that's slightly strange in English, but strange in a way to me, to my ear, it works and it's good, and it's something that no English writer would have found on their own initiative. It's something only a translator would find, or somebody writing in their second language, looking at the language looking at your own language from a slightly odd angle. So that's how I feel about weighing a translation.
What are you currently working on, Mark?
I'm just tidying up, finishing a book that I've been laboring over for years. The selected poems of a French writer who died 5-6 years ago, called Emmanuel Hocquard, who I liked a lot. Very, very different, totally different, very, very different type of writer from Anne. And I've been editing selected poems of him for New Directions. It's called The Thracian Spies Lay Sleeping Beside the Ships, which is the title of a wonderful title of a poem of his referring to the famous night episode in the Iliad. But the poem is a prose poem. It has nothing to do with the night episode in the Iliad. It's a very clever little title. And that's what it's called. The Thracian Spies Lay Sleeping Beside the Ships. Selected poems 1971 to whenever it is, 93 or whatever. 2003, if I forget. So I'm finishing that. That's by myself and several other translators, which ought to have been sort of fairly straightforward to do, but as anything but, because Emmanuel wrote books of poems. He didn't write sort of individual poems. So it took me it took me forever and a day to work out how to select from his work, because without it becoming too fragmented. Anyway, so that's coming out at the end of 2026 normally, I think. That's the idea. So I've got to write an introduction to that. So that's what I'm on there. And then we're back to Anne.
Now, before we end the conversation, can you read a passage from the novel?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got a nice passage for you, a fun passage. She laughs. She often laughs, and the circumstances in which she laughs can serve as a guide. She laughs, for instance, when reading a letter from long ago in which the narrator's mother knows she is dying and is explaining to a friend how her little children respond to the prospect of her death. As for the narrator, she writes, as always, he tries desperately to understand. Perhaps Fanny is being fatalistic in finding this desperate need to understand comical. It makes her laugh heartily, like the fussing over one's creature comforts, dressing warmly, pulling up a blanket, that so delighted her on the night train to Florence. Perhaps she thinks her friend a bit silly for wanting to understand everything and going to all this trouble to avoid falling ill and thereby prevented from exercising his favourite activity. Perhaps she thinks there's nothing to understand, that fate is there with her sledgehammer, knocking some people senseless and sparing others. And who knows, perhaps she's right. For the narrator, however, until he's examined the question from every conceivable angle, read all the books, and scrutinized all those faces, he won't reach a verdict. It's not that he's spineless, he's simply made in such a way that his life began with a question, and along the way all the things he has seen, read, heard, and experienced have given him part of the answer. But over the years, of course, these answers have grown more and more meagre, warped, swollen, and frayed, and he's so enamoured of this perpetual back and forth between edification and composition that he keeps on toiling away. Still, it's strange, and in her darker moments Fanny would tell him that he was the one who was ill. How after all this reading and thinking, he always returns to that 0 age when he left home for the first time, and in spite of his education and upbringing, and all he had experienced and learned up until then, found himself so bereft that he had to build everything from scratch. For every 100 books he read, he would advance by an iota, which is the smallest letter of the Greek alphabet, and not bad at all, considering he was starting from scratch, and that 10 or 20 iotas was a clear step forward. But perhaps life is horribly slow. Perhaps, compared to others, he has learned a great deal and made huge strides. He tries to imagine other people advancing by a single iota in 100 years, say, which makes him laugh so hard that he has tears running down his cheeks, like Monsieur Séguin's goat, who when he reaches the top of the mountain and sees how tiny Monsieur Séguin's house is down in the valley, sheds tears of laughter.